So
Yes.
I've no further questions. So I think it's now, and I don't believe Ms. Gray has any questions. So whether you have any questions for Lord.
Well, I do. Yes, just one, and really, I want to borrow from the expertise which you've had over years in Parliament, in a number of ministerial posts. It's often said that an emerging potential threat to public health needs to be dealt with speedily. You're nodding. What structures do you think are best capable of dealing with such a threat quickly?
What
structures?
Structures?
What organisation?
Well, you need a small decision-making team, and somebody has to have clear responsibility of taking a decision, and do what they can to do things, and sometimes step in and really just insist that we've got to take a decision. That is the ideal setup. It can be very difficult when the subject is a highly specialised one. I mean, you put it. I could try to think. You see, in terms of this, it's very difficult to think of an exact equivalent to this. If I could think of an example, the speedy response, the one that keeps leaping to mind inevitably because it's driven us all up the wall and it's dominant for us all at the moment, is COVID. And with hindsight, I suspect some inquiries are going to take years arguing that a lot of things should have been done quicker, straight away when they happened. And I think there were people at certain stages pressing impatiently to get on. And they did approve some things provisionally. And I think some things have been licensed now without going through the full process, but provisionally and subject to being withdrawn if anything goes wrong. But it's still to know what structure. The one delay that I do think is plain, looking at it, is this. Fortunately, it wasn't the first one. We'd already put out, the request was out there to all gays not to give blood. But the second one, the stronger worded one, obviously took too long. And it does seem to me, insofar as I can judge, and it's very difficult at this distance of time, is because too many bits of the department were allowed to get in. It kept being ready, cleared, and then somebody else wanted to have a look at it. And they all had a good argument for taking a look at it. It's difficult to know what structure. One person clearly in charge perhaps should have drawn a line after a bit. But again, isn't that easy to say in 2021 rather than at the time when some group had rather serious doubts about some part of the content. So I'm rather rambling around, not really answering your question, I'm afraid.
Well, what I think you've said so far is that the optimum, perhaps, is a small group with a decision maker who has executive power.
Yeah, somebody empowered, somebody, because a lot depends on whether the people are capable of taking decisions. The temperament of individual people, you can have people with very considerable talents but are very bad at decision making and always want to put it off and think about it a bit more, or always want more information and just delay a little longer. Other people are too impetuous and to come to everything that comes up, there's an instant decision making, and then their apparatchiks and the people who work with them have to come rushing in, try and persuade them to sit down. Let's have a talk about this. Shouldn't we just consult X, Y, and Z before we charge in? So it's very difficult. It's obviously not my scene to lay down some ideal management structure and ideal temperament for doing it quickly.
Well,
in this particular case, the delays largely were waiting for expert bodies to give advice, and it's speeding them up is quite tricky, but probably because in scientific problems, you've got to have the research, you've got to have the data, you've got to have the samples. So sometimes you're just waiting for adequate information to pile up and come in. You're waiting to discover the true nature of what you're dealing with, and waiting to try out various ways that might cure it or respond to it or minimise the risk and so on.
I suppose the danger is that process of waiting for a better degree of certainty defeats a lot of the
Well,
objective.
unfortunately, yes, that people are suffering all the time whilst you're hoping that you're going to get something demonstrably emerging that tells you what's happening and tells you what the best answer is.
I mean, if you take something...
As it happens, again, subject to that's only me, this is just one witness's reaction to the documents. Salvation in the end came with heat treatment. Now, whether anybody saw that coming, that was going to be the big, I didn't entirely, but that was it. That transformed everything. We got very little information about. I have no idea where that was devised, who was working on it. In my documents, maybe I've just not got to the right bit of the documents. Who it was came, which team came back and said, we find if you subject this plasma to heat treatment, pasteurization, they sometimes called it at the time, it seems to kill off the unattractive, the dangerous elements of, I think, hepatitis, ignore me if I'm wrong, hepatitis as well as AIDS. Suddenly, the world was transformed from once they started heat treating the blood products, and once they could heat treat the rot, that was practically the end of any problem. And funnily enough, it features less in the documents than practically anything else. By the time we had got self-sufficiency and no longer importing American blood products, it was a very good thing to do. It put everything on a really sound and secure basis for the future. But actually, it didn't make that much difference. We fortunately already got there because even the American products now were vastly safer, probably pretty safe, compared with the frightful problem and terrible consequences we've been experiencing through 1985.
So, in terms of the future, and if there are lessons to be learned from this tragedy, as you've called it, you would envisage a small group with someone with the executive decision-making ability and personality, but with expertise on tap. So it might be a system of
probably
experts on call.
It's better to have one person with two people sitting alongside giving strong advice. One person, but it's a terrible responsibility for one, and a human being has not been born who does not make mistakes.
No.
But I don't want a big team. A couple of people, perhaps of slightly different disciplines, who are close, and there's a team, but as long as it's clear who's in charge. The difficulty here, am I now, with the wisdom of hindsight, saying what it could have been done, what might have been in future? This was a multifaceted problem. And I say, the thing that saved lives, cured, ended the tragedy, largely, was something we hardly refer to, and I say I still haven't a clue where it came from. And it's not a very complicated, highfalutin nuclear science type solution. Pasteurization, heat treatment, worked. And now whether any kind of structure would have speeded that up or identified it quicker, I haven't a clue where that came from. And I suspect most of the people, most at the time, had no idea that work was going on this, and this was suddenly going to bring the worst of the nightmare to an end. I mean, it's been a nightmare ever since because of the consequences. But it's difficult. The same process. Some successor to you will be going through the same process again, probably for years, when we have this inquiry in COVID. Now that's not all medical. That's rather easier. That is, were decisions taken quickly enough? Were the right decisions taken? Were lobbies ignored? Did you really take notice of the science and medicine, but then combine that with your beliefs in what government could and couldn't do, and what human behaviour was going to be like, and what was going to be deliverable, and what wasn't, and all the rest of it. It is, although at the heart of it you have a new unknown disease, it's different to this. the early days in 83, 84, this is a kind of helplessness on all sides when HIV first comes, because, we hadn't had anything like this for years. And the first people it was a problem for was particularly homosexuals, and fatal every time at first. No cure. We were waiting for a vaccine, no vaccine. And then suddenly something seems to be happening with haemophiliacs. Why? What the how are they getting this? If they're not either rather promiscuous heterosexuals, if they're not sexually a little wayward like some homosexuals, some heterosexuals, why are haemophiliacs getting it when they don't seem to have had any unusual sexual life? All the way through, this is a sudden, almost instant, disastrous mystery, and so it's very know what structure would have dealt with it. And there were strong personalities. Some of the key figures are dead. The chief medical officer was very much in charge. I mean, I keep praising this chief medical officer, but he
praised chief medical officer from late 83.
I'm sure he was at first as completely perplexed by this new disease as everybody else was.
I think you've given us a rather different view of Sir Henry Yerodes.
Well, I don't want to be. I've probably upset his family or something. One of the officials in all my many departments, one of the very senior and responsible officials who, shall I say, failed to impress me. And I think you probably get the hint. I don't know. I haven't discussed it with any others, but I think you might find that's quite widespread. And I got the impression at the time I overlapped with him, but it was quite widespread amongst his deputies and the people who were working for him. He was not frightfully interested in getting involved in clinical medical decisions. I won't go on because I find out I've upset somebody who's related to him or something. But my own judgment doesn't matter much. But Henry was made less impression on me than practically any other senior civil servant that I've ever known. He took a strange approach to the job.
So in terms of this decision maker who's capable of making decisions, having executive power, he wouldn't be the man.
Decisions in this kind of thing. I'm sure. I don't know. I can't remember. I think it came up as Henry. If anybody asked Henry for advice, he probably would refer them to Diana Walford or somebody else and say, she does that kind of thing.
Yes, she I think rather regretted that she didn't have very much contact with Sir Henry.
He took a very, very close interest in the honours list for medics.
Yes.
That was exclusively his concern, to which we used to joke in the department. He devoted a very great deal of his time and had a very considerable filing system, and who got what honour was very much a decision for Sir Henry.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That's all that I.
I shouldn't have said that. I mean,
well,
that's quite irrelevant to your. And I'm going to say this is my honest opinion.
You've said it. There we are.
I couldn't have been more relieved when I got a totally different personality. I didn't appoint him, but suddenly emerged as my chief medical officer, a man who was passionately concerned with public health.
Well, thank you very much. That's all that I have to ask.
Oh, thank you very much.
Lord Clarke, there are no further questions then. Is there anything further you would wish to add?
Only to say that, it is one of those terrible incidents of my lifetime. I just repeat despite my strong feelings, it was a terrible tragedy. I'm very, very devoted to our health service. I think our health service is one of our great institutions. It's with clinical advance, and the amount we now spend on it, it's hugely better service than it was 30 years ago, but by the standards of the time, it was a good service. This is probably the worst tragedy that's ever occurred, and I feel, and everybody, I don't think all the people I work with, was acutely aware of the human suffering that was being caused whilst this HIV and then these infections spreading to haemophiliacs carried on, and we were desperately trying to find what was happening, how to stop them. And I genuinely feel great sympathies say the least. I mean, I wholly share everybody's concern for the fate of those not only who died, but their families and the people who continue to have problems. It's so the importance of the subject matter you're studying and its significance for many families cannot be underestimated.
Thank you, Lord Clarke. Sir Brian.
Well, thank you, Lord Clarke, for allowing us to trespass on your time by having you come here. I can't think that anyone who's listened to your evidence will forget it in a hurry. Given as it was in a style you yourself...
That's a very ambiguous remark. Yes.
Well, given as it was in a style which you yourself have described as combative and challenging, developing an understanding of what happened, which is a very large part of the inquiry's remit, is like piecing together a huge jigsaw. It depends upon documents, available recollections, context, and personality, in which each witness's evidence and how they give it represents one piece. So if questions trying to understand the shape and size of your particular piece of the jigsaw and how it fits in have been frustrating to you at times, I just want you to know that the answers have been helpful to us.
Thank you very much. I've no doubt you were warned in advance that I think probably maybe reassured compared with any of my colleagues. I mean, I've been a public figure, so you probably had the view of me before I arrived. I realise I am naturally rather combative. I'm not always patient. I mean, going back to decision making, I'm sometimes rather impetuous, and so anybody working with me has to get me, to sit down and really read the papers and think about it and take it. And I think we better get the permanent secretary in to listen to and so on. And I give long answers, and the older I get, bear in mind I'm now in my 80s, I think I get even more garrulous. But any journalist who's ever interviewed me on radio or television would tell you, they often say before we start, now short answers if we can, and if it's an old friend, somebody I know, I tend to say, look, John, you've had me in here before, so I'll do my best, but after about 2 minutes, I'm incapable of giving short answers. So I apologise to counsel to the Tribunal as well if I at times was showing signs of impatience or giving her long answers the whole time. I don't think I interrupted as much as I usually do. I think I've been spared.
Well, how much do you usually interrupt?
If I'm not careful, then I have to cure myself of that. I mean, with journalists, they interrupt you the whole damn time anyway. But so I could name journalists where everybody listening to us had to, if you weren't careful. Of course, it sounds terrible, so that's why I haven't stopped doing it. But but sometimes there were some journalists, they wouldn't let me finish a sentence and I wouldn't let them. But I think that I haven't cured myself of, but I hope I've modified that. But I still, as I am now, tend to give long answers.
Well, I hope you'll just bear with me for a moment while I mention a number of things to others. This is for everyone here and for those who are watching online or on YouTube. As you all know, this is our last hearing day before we break for the summer. Break, that is, from hearings. Work, of course, goes on. But I'd like to say 4 things at this stage. First, many of you have made a contribution to the work of the inquiry, and it's a reminder to all of us of the importance to many of the issues before us that so many have been following it in person or online. And very nearly 500 have followed us on YouTube and Zoom each day this week, together with a full house here at Fleetbank, as you know. And I've no doubt that there are many more still for whom watching may perhaps have been too difficult, who've kept in touch with the inquiry in their own way. But I'd like to thank you, each of you, whatever your perspective is, for being part of a collective endeavour to understand how and why such a tragedy occurred. You too have made a contribution. And I'd like to thank those of you who've been here in person. Whatever your perspective, however welcome the evidence has been, however enlightening, however difficult it may have been from time to time to listen to it, or however much you may have fundamentally disagreed with it, I'd like to thank each of you for showing the courtesy to the witness, which has allowed each witness to say what they wanted to say, as they would wish to say it, whatever their role may have been. Secondly, the inquiry will return from Tuesday, the 21st of September, when we will be at our new premises in Aldwych. We're starting with evidence from the former Secretary of State for Health and Social Security, Lord Norman Fowler, followed by evidence of the roles played by pharmaceutical companies and blood services. As we do so, I expect an increasing proportion of the evidence to relate more directly to those who suffered from hepatitis or HIV who are not also people with haemophilia. The whole of our terms of reference are being and will be considered. We will sit for quite a number of weeks in the autumn. The full timetable's yet to be finalised. And though these remain uncertain times, we'll endeavour to make progress no matter what challenges we might then be facing. Third, before Easter, I issued a statement of approach on final submissions. Now, during the summer break, I encourage all who are participants to continue thinking about the points they would wish to make in their final submissions. These will, of course, cover both the conclusions you think I should reach and the recommendations you hope I will feel able to make. Making recommendations is of central importance. They aim to help future generations learn the lessons of what happened, and perhaps to lessen the danger of history repeating itself. Submissions come at the end of the inquiry hearings. Potential recommendations require careful consideration, which may benefit from timetabling witnesses before the end with relevant expertise to help to inform those recommendations. So please treat this as advance notice that I'd like to have at least 3 months before submissions, and at least in outline, what, if any, recommendations you would wish me to consider making. Fourth, I said there were 4 points, and finally, I wish you all a restorative break.